Hi everyone, this is William with the weekly installment of the Romanov Dynasty of Russia. And we've been talking about the reign of Peter the Great, moving on from Muscovy, getting closer and closer to the establishment of the Russian Empire, which will happen in 1724. And we have been contrasting service in the Muscovite state in Holy Mother Rus, which was on a militia basis, and the changing of that due to Peter the Great's with his indomitable will being determined to move Russia forward in a very short period of time during his own lifetime, away from a sort of insular, Tsar-centered kingdom, very religious in foundation, with a militia, to a modern geopolitical state, and not only that, but a modern geopolitical great power. So one of the ways he did that was to institute very dramatic and far-reaching reforms of the nobility. So not only of the military itself, which we talked about last time, how important it was to Peter to establish a standing army with a professional officer corps and with an ethos centered not in service to the emperor himself as a person, as God's representative on earth, but to the state, to Russia as a great power state. But it ran deeper than that. His reform of the nobility, of course, the military was at the center, but it also ran deeper than that. And the two layers of society that were not reformed very readily were the peasantry, the serfs, who were not only left untouched by any kind of modernizing reforms, but in fact even went a little backwards, because the deal struck with the nobility during Peter's reign was that they would now own the serfs. The serfs wouldn't be attached to the land. The serfs would really be bound to their owners like slaves, and there would not be any kind of education for them, or they were to be left in this primitive state. The merchant class as well, a very necessary class for the functioning of society and, well, for the functioning of the state. And they had to modernize to a certain extent to keep up, and look toward international trade and things like that. But they weren't required to enter the service hierarchy. Now, as for the autocracy itself, it was modernized only very slightly. It was modernized only in the sense that there was an actual succession law issued in 1722. There had never been one before. And this was meant to avoid future, what to do about the sun. This was meant to avoid future succession crises, of which Russia had already had two. One that was disastrous and stretched on for 30 years, and one that was just very bloody and could have been disastrous when Peter the Great and his older brother became co-rulers of the state. So it was meant to not only to avoid that, but even more importantly, you could say, to allow the emperor to choose his own successor whether man or woman, whether highborn or lowborn, on the basis of merit, and that merit in particular being rooted in the willingness and the ability of that person to put the state above all else, the way Peter himself was putting the state above all else and saying, you owe your allegiance not to me in the first place, but to the state in the first place, and to me secondarily. So that was a huge, huge, huge change in outlook for everybody except the peasantry, basically. And they still remained in this state of mystical connection with the land and mystical connection with the Tsar. And a phenomenon started to emerge called naive monarchism, where the serfs who wanted to be freed and the peasants who in general wanted to have the land as their own, even though they had the idea of farming it communally, they wanted they wanted to view the Tsar still as this presence of God on earth, and so they invented a way to do that in the form of blaming everything on the nobles. The nobles were deceiving the Tsar and getting in between them and the Tsar, and this would certainly, have disastrous consequences in, the 20th century, up until the time of the Revolution, because when the peasants finally did get disillusioned with the Tsar, and when the Tsar, Nicholas II, just took for granted that they would always feel this mystical link to him, well, it ended in disaster, and especially if you consider that up until the time of the Revolution, the Russian population was over 90% peasant. And so, as amazing as Peter the Great was, that was a big, huge something to overlook, that created this fault line beneath the state that was so dear to him. All right. So the same year that the new succession law was promulgated, 2 years before the empire itself was established, another law was promulgated to modernize the nobility, and this was called the Table of Ranks. So it was not just to reform the nobility, it was also to put the entire state, outside of the peasantry and the merchants, on a modern footing, on a service footing. So I'm wearing my Polish hat today because it's a good illustration. The fact that it's not actually military, and the fact that the Congress Kingdom of Poland was part of the Russian Empire up until the time of the Revolution. And you would see, if you look at old film footage and things like that, you would see lots of people wearing hats like this, including students who weren't military. And if it had a hard brim like this, then it would have been a person who belonged to the upper echelons and not a peasant. The peasant would have had a soft brim. Okay, so let's talk about the Table of Ranks. So what it did was establish a service hierarchy, and the ranks themselves were borrowed from the Prussian model. So you see them across the board in Russia, whether you're talking about court, the military, you see these Russified German ranks. So, for instance, Nicholas II and the Romanov emperors had people called Flegel adjutants, who there was one Flegel adjutant on duty every day for a 24-hour period with the emperor. And this is from the German Flügel adjutant. It's spelled with umlaut, which makes it difficult to pronounce, but in German it would be spelled F-L-U umlaut G-E-L, and in Russian it's spelled with an E or an I, so Flegel adjutant, and it means wing adjutant, and it's just one example out of many of the German titles that you'll find within the Russian service hierarchy. I think no longer. That's an interesting question, though. I'm not sure if any of these German titles are kept to this day in Russia. Excuse me, I've got an allergy or attack or something going on. So the service hierarchy, I think I forgot to say, I meant to say that this was not only meant to reform the nobility, but to establish the Russian Empire, the service within the Russian Empire on a genuinely meritocratic basis. So Peter himself, beginning in childhood, had established these two play regiments, they were called. But, you know, they were play only in the beginning, and they became real regiments and real guards regiments, the Preobrazhensky and the Ismailovsky, how to pronounce that. And so they were always the most prestigious and the cornerstone of the Russian imperial state, although later on the Grand Dukes tended to gravitate toward the cavalry regiments. But Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich, for instance, who was the Governor General of Moscow under Nicholas II's reign, and Alexander III's, belonged to the Preobrazhensky regiment. They were infantry. So Peter began his own service, as he saw it, with these play regiments, and he began as a drummer boy. He didn't say, I'm the Tsar, even though I'm 10 years old, I'm the Tsar, and so I'm going to be the commander from the very beginning. Already, as a child, he wanted to show everybody, I can do it, and I'm serious about it. I'm a real soldier. So he started out as a drummer boy, and he made his way up through the ranks, and all the way up until, long after he'd left these regiments behind. Only then did he take the topmost rank. And this was what he intended for everyone, not just for the nobility, but for everyone who was in service. So all servitors were required to start at the lowest non-commissioned rank, as he himself had. They were required to start as privates. And they certainly weren't any better than their sovereign, and so that was demanded of them. And then to advance, if they advanced at all, in accordance to merit. So, later on, this would certainly be softened, and you wouldn't have, say, aristocratic servitors in the 20th century who were starting as privates. But you would start out at a military school in the 19th and early 20th century, and you would work your way up through that. So anyway, let's see, where was I going with that? So those who volunteered for this, those noblemen who volunteered for this and didn't have to, be coerced into it, they could start their service in special guards regiments that were filled with privates of the same social standing as them, so it wasn't humiliating for them. But again, they weren't exempt from needing to show their mettle and needing to show that they had some merit and that they could fulfill the functions of whatever rank they were at. And while Peter was alive, certainly this was taken very, very seriously. Now, the officer corps was exclusively noble. You could not be a non-nobleman and be in the officer corps, even under Peter. But there was a catch. Any man, however humble in background, even if he had been taken from the ranks of serfs and put into the army, and Peter did have to take serfs. You know, owners had to cough up a certain number of their serfs, because otherwise how do you build a standing army? Anybody who could legitimately work his way up from the lowest rank by his own merit and reached the rank of officer was automatically given a patent of nobility. So you could, through that route, go from being a serf to a nobleman. And I believe that the ranks were numbered, and I believe it was rank 8 that allowed any person in the service to be ennobled. Not with a title, but they had a patent of nobility, and they had all the privileges of the nobility, and their children would be nobles. All right, so the nobles, of course, at first were horrified by this, even the petty nobility. So the aristocracy were, of course, horrified with the idea that the lower nobility could now advance and take the preeminent positions in the service on the basis of merit, and no aristocrat could simply take it for granted that they would be given the best positions. But for the petty nobility, that was a good thing. But on the other hand, they then had to look at, every private in the army as someone who could potentially compete with them. So everybody was a little upset about this. So Peter had his own way of coercing his own ways, of more or less forcing his nobility to accept this new meritocratic model and this new universal service model. Well, universal outside of the peasantry and the merchants. So the way to do this was to say, if you did not serve, you did not count. You could keep your land, you could stay out in the countryside and be a great seigneur and own peasants, but you didn't count. If you didn't have a rank, you had no social position, and you had no public position. You had no role in public life. You were an outsider. And believe me, that was a very strong incentive. So another thing that Peter meant to do, although this had begun to start before his reign, was to break down the clan mentality. So the boyars, the nobles, had been arranged in clans, and it was the clans that vied for importance, not the individuals. An individual could be someone who didn't take to military service, someone who wasn't interested in it, and let other members of the clan take on that role. But in order for this professional service class to succeed, you had to get rid of that clan mentality. So that was another thing that this was meant to do. And the onus was now put upon the individual, no matter what family he came from. He had to rise or fall, obtain a rank or not obtain a rank on the basis of his own merit. And if he wanted to be seen to partake of the glory of being part of a great geopolitical great power and empire, if he wanted to have any part of that in his personal identity, then he needed to serve, and only then could he have any meaningful status. And his rank would be the outward symbol, a very tangible outward symbol of his individual value to the empire. And so this would then put his personal identity on a completely different basis. And the more he viewed himself as a professional military officer or servitor, the more he viewed himself as investing his own honor in the honor of the state. So anything that besmirched the honor of the state or reduced it also besmirched his honor and reduced him. The more he adopted the Western chivalric code of personal honor, the better he would succeed in Peter's Russia, and the more devoted he would be to the things that mattered to Peter. So I did my entire master's thesis on this subject of the Petrine military ethos and what a revolutionary thing it was. And you had plenty of nobles who took to this enthusiastically, probably especially young men who wanted to prove themselves and who wanted to stop feeling like they were looked down on by Westerners. You know, as Russia gained more and more contact with the West, it became more and more odious to them to think that they were looked upon by Westerners as barbarians and backward. And so, you know, they began to take pride in the accomplishments of the Russian Empire too, and in their own accomplishments. And so it was, you know, by and large, it was a success. But, you know, again, you still had this fault line that had now come into existence between Imperial Russia and Russia of the Table of Ranks, and Russia of service and international greatness on the one hand, and the old traditions and the church and the old Muscovy. And Peter didn't stop short of reforming the church. He also, following in his father's footsteps, his father had brought Russia into line with the Greek Orthodox Church and Byzantine Orthodox practice, instead of allowing it to get further and further and further away from that. And that created this tremendous schism, so you had the old believers. That was Peter's father. But Peter himself got rid of the church position of patriarch and created the Holy Synod, which had at its head a lay person. So even the church was brought into this. And it was not just the military. So we talked about that in relation to my cap just now. Peter instituted his table of ranks for the entire educated population of Russia. So you would have a rank at court, you would have a rank in the diplomatic corps, and both of those things, I think, were fairly standard. I think that existed in other imperial or royal courts and in the diplomatic corps of other countries. But Peter added it to the scholarly, the scholars and universities, and he also added it to the civil service. So if you were in the civil service, or if you were at a university, or if you were a scholar, you also had a table of ranks that was parallel to the military table of ranks, exactly parallel, although with different titles. And you too, if you were in the civil service and started out as a simple clerk of humble background, you too could work your way up to gaining a patent of nobility. And so if you read any 19th or early 20th century pre-revolutionary Russian literature, you are going to come across this host of confusing titles. The first one that springs to my mind is collegiate counselor. So anybody who worked in any office in the bureaucracy had a rank that was equivalent to a military rank and had a uniform that you would wear on special occasions. I think they just wore civilian clothes on a day-to-day basis, but they had military style uniforms, and students did as well. And if you got the equivalent of a modern PhD or a doctorate in a Russian university, you also were ennobled and got a patent of nobility. So if I'd been in Imperial Russia when I got my PhD, I would have become a nobleman despite coming from a middle-class background. But on the other hand, it was very difficult for a person of humble origins to get into a university. A person who, there was something under Alexander III where he tried to bar university entrance to what he called, I think it was cook's children or coachman's children. So you can see how the Petrine ethos in some ways began to erode. And in other ways it had a resurgence. For instance, it was later in the empire that Grand Ducal rank advancement through the ranks started to drop. So all Grand Dukes would be born technically as both privates and generals. Later, they were born generals when they received the Order of St. Andre, and things were slipping away from the Petrine Table of Ranks, but then there was a sharp correction. During the period of great reforms, Grand Dukes, too, started having a much slower progression through the ranks. But that's getting way ahead of where we are now. So I just wanted to show one of my favorite works of Russian literature. This is from the 19th century, and it concerns Russia in the years when it was still actually, it was pre-1861, which is when the serfs were freed. And so the main character of this novel, Oblomov, is raised with serfs to do everything for him. And his parents even frown on it when he, as an adolescent boy, wants to run around and get things for himself and do things for himself. And his parents say, what the heck are these three guys for? Vaska and Zakhar, and he has three serfs who wait on him hand and foot. And so the point of the novel is how this absolutely ruins Oblomov. So, there's this long, brilliant chapter about what life is like at Oblomovka, the family's estate, and how basically nobody does anything, and how they pride themselves on doing nothing and leading this sort of pastoral and idyllic existence with their serfs. But the fly in the ointment at Oblomovka is that even the Oblomovs have to reckon with the Petrine Table of Ranks, even, more than a century after it was instituted by Peter. So they send this spoiled, obese young man, Ilya Ilyich Oblomov, off to Petersburg to work just long enough in the civil service in order to get a rank. It doesn't have to be a high rank, but he has to have a rank. Because if you don't have a rank, as I said, you're nobody. You can't hold your head up among the other nobles. So he goes into the civil service, and he works for a while, and he doesn't show any interest or merit, and as soon as he has his rank, he drops out and goes back to his life as a completely indolent person. And so this novel talks about basically the disastrous effect that serfdom had on generations of the Russian nobility. Those who weren't motivated could go and get the lowest rank and be all right. So that did not work out the way Peter envisioned it, but, it was a start. So this, of course, is extremely important to the Grand Dukes, to Grand Ducal service, and the image that the Grand Dukes themselves had of their own service, the extent to which it was important to them as individuals, each one of them on his own, and the extent to which it affected public opinion of them. So public opinion began to be a real thing, whereas it hadn't before. There were the beginnings of civil society in the 19th century and at the period of great reforms, and there was a disastrous instance, I should say, during the Russo-Turkish War in 1878, where Grand Dukes were there on the battlefield. There were a lot of them at that period because of this Grand Ducal baby boom in the 19th century, and they did not perform well. And this was publicized. And so that was then when there was some realization that the Grand Dukes needed to be brought back into line with the Table of Ranks themselves. Okay, so we are creeping in that direction. I think we have another, there's so many important reforms during Peter's the reign that I want to talk about that a little bit more. And then we will move on to the post-Petrine 18th century, and we will see how Peter's ideas, which of them took roots and which of them began to fade, and indeed whom he himself chose as his successor, as the person that he trusted the most to carry out, to preserve his reforms and make sure that they went forward and that Russia remained a great power state. All right, I hope to see you next week. Bye.